The Cornelius, Oregon Church of Christ welcomes you. Join our Sunday morning adult Bible class as we study the Book of Galatians. Paul tells us of the one gospel, how faith justifies us, and how does that justification save us and fulfill the law of Christ.
So we were in Galatians chapter 2, and we had looked last week at verses 1 through 10, kind of a reminder of what we were talking about in the early part of this text. That the big struggle of the New Testament church was one that we might use the word racial. The Bible uses the word race, but only in terms of the Jew and the Gentile. In ancient times, it might have been more the idea that you considered a race by the language that you spoke. So things have changed since that time, how we consider these things. But we would say that there is a demographic or a racial divide between the church because of the Jew and the Gentile. A very natural one, because if you had been raised a Jew, if you had been raised an Israelite, somebody under the law of Moses, what was your association with Gentiles supposed to be like? Non-existent, very limited, limited to only, transactional or something like that, that you were supposed to be careful. Again, I'm always, struck by Peter's way he looks at Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, and Peter is diligent in his faithfulness to the law of Moses, we would say in times past. So it really is interesting that now you've got to change your mindset and embrace people that you were raised believing were, apart from you. You have to embrace them like they are your brothers and sisters, and that could be a difficult thing, of course. Paul relates how it was that he had gone to Jerusalem, and we said this is probably the circumstances in Acts chapter 11 where there was a famine that was coming, and the saints in Antioch took up a collection to help the saints down in the area of Jerusalem, and so that collection was what brought him down there, and they brought with them Titus. Titus is a Gentile. What's the difference between Titus and Timothy? We know they're both men that were that Paul trained as evangelists, and of course the letters to these two men are parallel letters. They're both to evangelists, but what's the difference in those two? Because later Timothy is circumcised, whereas Titus is not. What's the difference there? Go ahead, Michael.
Timothy was his mother was a Jew.
Yeah, Timothy's mother was a Jew. So it seems that Paul's thought in Acts chapter 16 to circumcise Timothy was so that people didn't feel like, of course, Jews that don't practice the law of Moses are going to tell us that it's been put away. It seems to be a stumbling block. But Paul makes it clear there was never any expectation or consideration that Titus would need to be circumcised. So that seems to be the big idea. Up through verse 10, they desire only we remember the poor. And we mentioned in our closing thoughts that the poor in the context are the Acts chapter 11 poor that were mentioned there, the saints in Jerusalem and Judea that they had brought this to. Now, by the way, that's not the end of that need. We know that need goes on for years, the saints in Judea, which kind of makes sense. It's not as though a famine is just a once and done kind of thing. We can understand that it could take years for a recovery to happen. So we know that even in the book of 1 Corinthians, they're talking about a collection for the saints in Judea. 2 Corinthians, they're talking about a collection for the saints in Judea. So that's a conversation that goes on for a while in the New Testament about that need. So any other comments about verses 1 through 10 before we pick up and move forward? Any other thoughts? I want to get to, Grant, go ahead.
I was going to say, I've been thinking about last week when we talked about verse 10, about asking them to remember the poor. I think it's interesting because we know both Paul and Barnabas, Barnabas' case, he was very wealthy, and in Paul's case, he's very highly educated. And, both of those are circumstances where you might look at somebody like that and think, well, I'm worried about how they're going to treat people who they might, in the worldly sense, look as beneath.
That's a good point. That in other words, the saints might have had some small concern that maybe these guys see themselves as above the needs of the poor, as opposed to directly meeting those. So that's a very interesting case. Sometimes, by the way, I've kind of looked at this passage. There's always a question about to what degree do we help brethren in their need. Meaning sometimes the question is, well, we're only helping people with their, the food that they have to have or their very immediate, very personal needs. Conversely, some say, well, we'll help them with anything they want. I think that this terminology here, just describing them as impoverished, might give us a hint to say that it's that difficulty that impoverishment brings. That's generally the thing that we're trying to help people with. And this, of course, isn't a regular assistance. This isn't the assistance that comes to people constantly, like we see the widows in 1 Timothy chapter 5. This is as needed, we would say emergency. This is a conversation that we have as a congregation a lot. We have this conversation a lot about requests for help and when we should help out of the church's collection or when we should help privately and personally. And one of the things we consider is verse 10, that the church was authorized to help people who suffered from difficulties with impoverishment. Go ahead, Stephen.
Could the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem have been persecuted?
Wow, that's a great question. So I would strongly say that the answer is yes. And I would say we find that over in 1 Thessalonians as well. We would say in 1 Corinthians or in Acts chapter 8, Paul was a part of the persecution of the saints in Jerusalem. So we would say that they're persecuted there. I would also say that in 1 Thessalonians, there's a conversation about, I may actually want to be in 2 Thessalonians. I may be misremembering this. Maybe it is 1 Thessalonians, and he'll make the comment there about them suffering as their brethren in Judea do through persecution. And if somebody remembers that verse, yell it out. I can't recall exactly where that was in the Thessalonian letter, but I was thinking it was in the very beginning of the first book. But he does, in other words, in 1 Thessalonians, I believe it is, he does make this statement that they are being persecuted, and he makes the comment to the Thessalonians, you're being persecuted like your brethren in Judea are being persecuted. Grant? Chapter 2 and verse 14. Thank you, Grant. So in chapter 2 and verse 14, it says, you, brethren, became imitators of the churches of God, which are in Judea, for you suffered the same things from your own countrymen, just as they did from the Judeans. So that was the passage I was looking for.
That could make them poor.
Right, absolutely. Stephen, that's a great comment to say, if suddenly you found you couldn't be employed, because of your belief, somebody says, I heard, Saul, I heard that you're a Christian now. And, the guys at the synagogue told me I can't hire you anymore. Can you imagine that would be a common type of persecution? It's not one we think about because we're usually thinking about physically assaulting somebody, but financial persecution might be the first and most common persecution. Stephen, that's a great comment. And I really appreciate that because, again, it just is something for us to think about because today, I know a lot of us, when we think about persecution, the most real persecution we'll face as Christians is probably with regards to employment. That we're going to be times where we're expected to do things or say things in our jobs that we say we can't do, and they say, well, you can't continue here. We've seen members of this congregation lose jobs over the matters of the gospel. They weren't allowed to keep their job over matters of the gospel. It does happen. Like I said, we have a member who actually moved since it happened, but we have a member that lost their position because they held a scriptural position and it wasn't in line with what things say. So Stephen, again, that's a great comment for us to think about. That poverty is definitely one of the things that persecution brings about. So I really appreciate that. Any other comments before we move on? So let's go ahead and do some reading. I'm going to grab two readers, one to go 11 through 16, and then 17 through 21. 11 through 16, Lamar, Isaac, 17 through 21, if you would.
Galatians 2, verse 11. Now when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face, because he was to be blamed. For before certain men came from James, he would eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. But when I saw they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, if you, being a Jew, live in the manner of Gentiles and not as the Jews, why do you compel Gentiles to live as Jews? We who are Jews by nature are not sinners of the Gentiles, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Christ Jesus, that we might be justified by faith in Christ, and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law, no flesh shall be justified.
But if, while seeking to be justified in Christ, we ourselves have also been found sinners, is Christ then a minister of sin? May it never be. For if I rebuild what I have once destroyed, I prove myself to be a transgressor. For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. In the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died needlessly.
So this passage is a very substantial passage for us to consider, both from a doctrinal perspective. A couple of things, items of doctrine are important to be discerned here, but also some very practical things about behavior and the consequences of behavior. So there's two things that we might draw out of this that have some significant substance for us to consider. Let's just kind of summarize it, though, what we understand. First of all, Peter is speaking about an event that we may or may not have a good concept of. And it's an event that occurs in one of two places. It's either an event that happens at the end of Acts chapter 12. I put 12:17, or in the middle of Acts chapter 12. And in that passage, it says that Peter departed Jerusalem. It doesn't say where he went, but the next time we encounter him, it seems that he's in Antioch. So very likely Peter left Jerusalem, Acts chapter 12, went to Antioch. And it's very possible that this is this circumstance that says at the end of that time that Paul goes back to Antioch. At the end of chapter 12, it says Paul and Barnabas returned to Antioch. And this is a circumstance where Paul says, I came there and found this circumstance and corrected it. So a lot of people think, actually this is what I think too, that we're talking about an event that happened here. Some people see, though, that in Acts chapter 15, the very similar thing seems to happen, but it doesn't identify who. It just says that people came from Jerusalem to Antioch and said, all these Gentiles here need to be circumcised. And there's a big division, so they put together a group of people that go down to Jerusalem to try to get this straightened out. Well, that sounds a lot similar to what's going on here. So some people think, well, maybe that's what this is. It probably isn't too significant, except to say, if Acts chapter 15 is what's going on here, then it almost might be the case that Peter doesn't seem to, get it twice, or that there's some sense of Peter really missing the mark here. Like I said, I kind of like Acts chapter 12 as being the moment this happens, so that by Acts 15 we see everybody going to Jerusalem to get this straightened out, and they probably have a good understanding of it. Doesn't matter too much. But we want to appreciate the idea that what is going on, that Peter comes to Antioch, Paul is going to have to withstand him. He's going to be confronted by Paul for his behavior in this manner. And what's interesting about this is that it says that these were men who had come from James. Now, I'm going to be careful to say, I don't think that this is the idea that James was truly a false teacher, but if they came with James's thinking on this, then James didn't understand this subject as well. Neither did Barnabas. Neither did, in verse 13, it talks about Barnabas. But it sounds like a lot of brethren didn't understand what was meant to happen here. So there was a big question about this. And this becomes kind of a very simple idea. And it's not so much the idea about circumcision as what's going on in the church. Can you see in verse 12, what the real issue is? Like I said, it's not as though people are coming down and saying, hey, all these guys got to get circumcised. What's happening in the church in Antioch? What's the big problem that's going on? Go ahead, Andy.
Socialization.
Socializing. And how is that socializing going?
Yeah, it's not going very well.
Right.
I wanted to speak to the comment you made earlier about persecution today they are persecuted through, maybe work, standing up for what we believe in our rights. But, as a Christian, but as a person of color, female, an older lady, I can say that there are definitely other persecutions that people deal with who are not of your color and sex.
Right.
Today.
Right.
And so I think this is really great to see how the Bible points out that Christ comes to fulfill the world. This is a situation of the law where they're trying to, are you circumcised? Are you this? Are they pointing to points in the law that were given? But it's really a matter of the heart. They did not want to associate with Gentiles.
Right. I think so.
That's what it is. There's so much nuance.
Yeah.
That there were just so many things. Is it circumcision? Is it eating? Is it?
Yeah.
It's so many different things. It's the lifestyles, cultures, norms, and different things that made them uncomfortable because they weren't like their own. They were unwelcome. And so I love how Christ came to fulfill the law and show that it is not just maybe if we're at work or maybe if we're standing up. There's so many things. It's whether you're accepting of others or not.
Yeah.
And it's your heart.
Yeah. So there's an interesting statement in Romans where Paul says we are to accept one another, and I've often thought, we've even done sermons on that passage to say that this idea of accepting one another is to see each other through the light of Christ and not through the categories that we typically see each other, whether it's, we can divide it in so many ways, financial tends to be a big one, how we categorize people or their marital status, whatever it is, and that Christ sees neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. And that Paul has to kind of push on that idea. Here's an interesting thing to think about, though. As I said, it isn't directly mentioning that it's circumcision that they're actually fighting about. I mean, it is the circumcision, in other words, the Jews and the Gentiles, that's the division. But it may not even be the idea that, like I said, perhaps it's not till Acts 15 that somebody shows up and said, you got to be circumcised. It may be more the idea that here you have a church of Jews and then you have a church of Gentiles. And what is the natural inclination of any group of people? The most natural thing that we do if we're in a large group of people, Tacho? To have cliques. Tacho, what do we form our cliques on?
I think it was because they were Gentiles and we're separate from them.
Okay. So what would cliques look like today? Lamar?
That can be a variety of things. It's any separation that we do.
Yeah.
In the church, it can be outside, it can be that draws us away from doing what Christ told us to do. Accept each other, serve each other, love each other.
So it's the thing I want us to kind of go ahead, Becky.
It's the natural tendency to associate with people that are like you.
That's it. That's what I wanted to say. The people like me. So what do I do? Well, Michael, I'm going to throw you under the bus. Michael and I are a lot alike. We're married. We have 2 kids, a son and daughter. We're close to the same age. Michael's obviously much older. But it's natural to say, I'm going to gravitate towards somebody like Michael as opposed to somebody who's single or who's much older or much younger or who's here's the thing, like financially. If somebody's really poor, I might say, I don't want to go out to lunch with them. I might embarrass them. Can you see how I'm being kind and thoughtful and exclusionary in my thinking? Here's the thing I want us to appreciate. It is so easy and natural and common for churches to fall in cliques of people that I have a lot in common with. And by the way, one of the problems we point to in denominationalism is sometimes churches encourage it. They try to divide the congregation into social groups so that we say, hey, you got a social group. Now I'm going to pause for a second and say there's nothing wrong if the 3 guys that I know that like to go hiking, and we don't invite the person who hates hiking. That's not really what I'm saying. But if I begin an association that excludes others, because like I said, I just think, I don't think they want to be a part of it. And I'm not accepting of every person in that sense. That's when a clique becomes a problem. It is probably one of the chief complaints of local churches. Let me say this again because I want us to appreciate that this could be our accusation. It is one of the chief complaints of individual members in a local congregation is they say, I don't feel like I belong here. Because there are groups that I'm not a part of. That is super common. It's super easy. And it's something that everybody has to be aware of and consciously working against, consciously trying to get away from, that we do these things. I saw a comment over here. Stephen, go.
I was thinking the Corinthian church.
Yeah. Let there be no divisions among you. Some say I'm of Paul, others of Cephas and Apollos. It's very interesting that they all had they were dividing up into groups. So good point. What else do we got? Go ahead, Mark.
In the school district, it's interesting that we have like the discrimination. We have those trainings every year, and then they added I can't remember the word. You thought you're not a racist.
Yeah.
So we're being made aware that we probably have to check ourselves.
Yeah.
What we do also, and it's interesting seeing this is Peter. He's a hypocrite.
Yeah. Right.
Hypocrite, and I always remember what your dad said, and in fact I have it on my phone. Nothing's meaner than mean.
Nothing meaner than a mean Christian, yeah. And the irony is, a lot of mean Christians don't mean to be mean. But that exclusionary thing cuts to the bone. I mean, it's a vicious thing. Now, I want to pause for a second. I want to play with this idea just a little bit more. We still haven't even touched the doctrinal point I want to get to. I suspect that everybody was okay with what was happening. Now you might think at first, I bet those Gentiles were up in arms because they were being excluded. I doubt it. I think the opposite. I think probably let's imagine like if we're Jews and Gentiles and, over time all the Jews sit over here. What do they have to talk about? Well, for one thing, they might even speak a different language than the Gentiles over here. So they might just sit down and talk to themselves in Hebrew, and our Gentiles over here are like, well, I don't speak Hebrew, so I'll just be over here with, my Gentile pals. And so we'll talk about, hey, did you have that ham sandwich over? It sounds silly, but think about how easy it would be to start to think, they have their group, we have our group, they like their group, we like our group, and we're all okay with that because we're comfortable with each other. And honestly, if I took Isaac out of the Gentile group and threw him over into the Jewish group, Isaac is probably going to say, I was real uncomfortable. I didn't know what I could talk. They talk around me and I didn't know what they were saying. I'm pretty sure they were talking to me because they pointed at me and laughed. But that sense of compelling this amalgamation. Which is, by the way, what Paul is going to use a lot of Galatians to do, but he also uses some other books to do this too, that we're supposed to, be reconciled as one body with one mind towards each other. That I think it was super easy and natural and common and probably acceptable that they slowly broke into two groups. And I imagine it, I said, I think I got my people backwards. I think it said when Peter got there, when Peter came, that this is the confrontation that they're going to have about this issue, that there's a division, and they seem to have accepted this, and it's just not something that was acceptable. Gregor, thanks for waiting.
When you go to a foreign country where you don't really speak the language and it's a completely different culture, it is very natural, as you're pointing out, to have these two divides. And in the Pauline period, that time during the Roman history, language and culture were the two big things that separated everybody. When I was in Africa, it was something that the 8 of us that were there to work with the local churches had to actually occasionally call each other on and say, you're not spending enough time with your brother, because it's so much easier just to stay with the like language.
Right.
And as Christians, our job, we have to remember what's important, and it's the things that are describing the Bible. Everything else is irrelevant. And to Mark's point, people say you need Christians, but we do have certain things I can only accept. I'm sorry, there's certain behaviors that I have to say that's not right, but I can do it in the most loving possible way, but that's all I can do. I can't sit there and say, okay, you know what, you're right, it's okay. Because it's not.
Yeah.
So we struggle between being truthful and being integrated, and the integration is a choice. It has to be a mental choice. It has to be perfect.
And I want to be careful to say, a lot of times this is a conversation, we think about how we're dealing with the world, but we're really just talking about the body of Christ. We're talking about believers too, in particular, and our need to be extremely aware of the idea that we have members here that weren't born in the U.S. You know what that might mean about their English? It may not be as easy. I tell you what, Gregor hinted at this, to go to Africa and to pick up a language. It's going to be a long time before you're very fluent with it, before you understand what's going on. And I would bet all the money I have, if I were a gambling man, shouldn't be, that every member of the church was born somewhere else, spoke a different language, came here, will say, yeah, it was hard to feel like I fit in as long as I was struggling with the language. And so what becomes the question? The question becomes, how then do I make it easier for them to feel like they're part of the group? How do I make it easier for them to feel like they belong? And by the way, again, this, language is a great one because it's easy to see and it's easy to imagine. But money, some people can't afford to do some things. Marriage, some people are single and some people married, and sometimes you want to do something as couples, and sometimes that you're excluded. There's just so many things we can point to and say, this is a place where we exclude people and we think we're doing them a favor. We think, I don't think they'd be comfortable here. And Paul comes and he said, and by the way, I'm going to step out on a limb so far as to say, what's interesting is we don't really know for sure what Paul's mind or Peter's mindset is. But what if it was just, I just want everybody to get along, and I think this is the easiest way to do it? What if that's all it was? Lamar, thanks for waiting.
A couple things from mind. Paul here is addressing Peter and James, two of the prominent apostles, because they wrote so many Testament. And they were with Christ. We know that they spent the time with him, but even they had this challenge of being accepting and looking at others as they should. And as Satan works, a lot of times we look at sins and automatically say, we're not going to murder or
Right.
adultery, those things, but it's these kind of things that really are the traps for us.
Yeah. I think what's interesting is you look at something like the sin of partiality, which James chapter 1 warns us, brethren, don't be partial towards one another. In that instance, he talks about it in the financial, the prejudice that we might have. But that sense of partiality is really easy. Now I'm going to pause for a second. I want to say this one more time. This isn't saying that it's wrong for, I think our younger people are getting together tonight to play volleyball, But guess what? They haven't told me anyway. The cap off Mr. Haynes is 25. You're not allowed to come. But it's not wrong that we say, hey, they're going to go do something. In fact, we say, okay, that's good. But maybe we need to appreciate the idea. I appreciate the fact that Al's there. Al and Richie are there a lot. You don't see Al playing a lot necessarily. Yeah, but Al is there because, the Bible wants us mixed up in groups. The Bible doesn't, I'm going to say something dramatic. The Bible doesn't want youth groups. The Bible wants older men teaching younger men and older women teaching younger women. It doesn't want, all the young people set off from the church, all the single people set off from the church, it wants everybody together working hard at having all things in common. And that's really hard. That's something that you're going to have to bring your A game to. I know it's a sports reference, I don't understand it. But I know it means the idea you've got to bring a diligence to saying to yourself, you know what do I have in common with this brother or sister over here? Maybe I don't have a lot in common. Maybe even we don't even have a language in common. But the most important thing we have in common is the blood of Christ. I got to figure out how I draw myself close to them. I have to have a relationship with every person in the body of Christ. That's the thing we're pursuing here. And that's the work we've got to do. Go ahead, Adrian.
Those outside of Christ, in the motive,
Yeah.
to view them as humane and
Yeah.
worthy of having the word of God.
And what did Paul say about that? He said, I've become all things to all men, and it's interesting because, Paul goes to Mars Hill and debates with Greek philosophers. And Paul went to Roman emperors. Paul really became all things to all men. And there's an important point to say, and I think Gregor kind of alluded to the idea there are things I'm not going to practice or accept, but kindness is always easy. And gentleness, and there's always characteristics that we can bring to the table that can temper these conversations to the world too. It's important to appreciate that, because I wouldn't want to be the reason. And I tell you what, maybe a big one that I like to talk about a lot is politics, because that's another one that's easy to be broken up into groups about. I would hate for somebody to say, Brian, saw all those signs and stickers and things you have on your car. I don't know. I'm hoping nobody has a lot of stuff in your car, because I'm trying to think of this. But I saw those things in your car, Brian, and I thought, well, I don't think Brian's church would really feel good about me being there. I would never want anyone to say I didn't belong there because of some way you live your life, Brian. That I have a liberty to live my life, but I should surrender that liberty if I want to make people feel comfortable to be here. And that can be tricky. It can be tricky. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of sacrifice. And again, it's not saying I can't have opinions and I can't tell people what I'm thinking and I can't be in groups of people that are like me. It's saying that I am mindful that if that's all I am, I'm not living up to the standard I need to live up to. And like I said, I'm trying to talk about a fine line here that's hard to grasp, but it's important. And it's important that we see it here. Anybody else want to have a comment on this? Go ahead, Stephen.
I'm thinking that this is a meal that was separated them. Peter went over to sit with them. I think what their diet or what they're permitted to eat was quite different between the Jew and the Gentile.
Absolutely, yes, good. And again, like I said, I would say to myself, if I'm the Gentile and I invite, Sherry's the Jew and I invite Sherry over for dinner, I might think, Sherry's so picky. She just doesn't, that, and honestly, how many of us even to this moment could say, I can remember all the laws that the Jews things they can and can't eat. The truth of the matter is, while we might say, Sherry, it's not the law anymore. You just need to eat this octopus with me, Yeah, did you see that look on Sherry's face? But the truth of the matter is, what I should say is, Sherry, and by the way, this is going to be a big part of 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and Romans chapter 14. Sherry, if I know that bothers you, that's not what we're going to eat. We're going to eat lamb. I'm not a big fan of lamb, but we're going to have lamb because I wouldn't want to upset Sherry. I would want Sherry's conscience to be there. But it's so tempting to say, Sherry likes what she likes, and I know Larry and I like, a good ham sandwich. So, we just don't appreciate how big a deal it is what we eat. Let's just be honest, in cultures, today, now, people eat things that we don't eat. One of the big things down in Peru that the saints, that people eat down there, guinea pigs. A little different. Grant, thanks for waiting.
I think Lamar was kind of going this direction earlier when he said, a lot of times we look at something, a sin like murder, and most of us don't have a problem with not murdering. But partiality is something that everybody struggles with, and I think the thing that we want to say is that's not a problem. I don't even see race or gender or XYZ.
Yeah.
But the truth is, if you say you aren't seeing it or it's not a problem,
right.
You're just not paying attention.
I want to say, and I think Mark kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier. I want to say what Grant said again. There's a sense where I've met lots of brethren that say, I just don't even think that way. The human nature thinks that way. So the likelihood that you don't think that way is not really you're probably just, and unfortunately it's become stigmatized in our society. So we just kind of are afraid that you need to accept it's probably something we're always going to battle with, that we just naturally find ourselves in certain circumstances where, we think, like I said, it's just natural for us to all, associate with people that are like us. And somebody says, oh, I just don't even think that way. You need to think about thinking that way. You need to think about the fact that you could think that way. Even if you don't, really, you need to ask yourself, well, why don't I? Because I need to accept the idea that that's not the case. But we want to believe, and like I said, again, because it's become stigmatized, we don't want to be that person, but we should acknowledge that the natural man has this bias, has this preference, shows preference to things that are like them. That's the natural man. It's kind of like saying, lust, my mind just doesn't even work that way. If I said that, you'd say, well, Ron, your mind might be broken, because that's just a natural part of human minds that think. And that's how it is with our prejudices, that it's just a natural part of how we think. And we don't want to acknowledge that. We don't want people to know that because it's embarrassing, but it's something we have to battle all the time. And we have to be aware of that battle. Grant, you didn't finish, so go ahead.
I was just saying, and I think, part of that comes from the difference between how we're supposed to think and how the world thinks, which is that we're saying that something that's natural usually a lot of times means it's not good.
Yeah,
trying to not just give in for natural science.
Right.
Because the world kind of wants that.
Now I will add this little caveat too. In a lot of the doctrines of the world today, there's a neo-Calvinism that's come into that. And what I mean by that is there's a teaching that you can't change your nature. That if something is natural to you, you have no ability to control that. That's a neo-Calvinistic way of saying Calvinists believe you can't stop sin. You can't stop. Well, the Word of God says, no, you can. You're going to have to exercise effort at it, but you can control desire. You can control anger. You can control. The world says, no, it's, you've heard this one, I'm born that way. I'm, whatever it is, I can't control that. The Bible denies this idea of a neo-Calvinistic can't control it, and instead says, no, you can control these things, and you should. I know I saw another hand up. Mark, please.
When you talk about food, it reminded me of the great example Jean Cannavero. We invited her for the first time at our house. She's gluten free. So I'm like, okay, Jean, what can I prepare for you so I can make it, And she's like, oh dear, don't worry about me. I'll take medicine, cook whatever.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about that is you're kind of pointing to the idea of the opposite side of being not easily offended. That if I go into somebody's house and they offer me something that, they offer me that guinea pig, that I say, you know what, I'll eat it. You ever wonder what the first time Paul got offered bacon, what was that moment like? And, I suspect Paul put aside any conviction so that he could be all things to all men. So it's a two-sided thing to say I both won't be, I'll do everything I can not to offend a brother if I know they have a weakness, or they're, and weakness meaning that this is something that particularly, has an effect on them. But on the other side of that, I won't be the person that's easily offended. So talked about a lot. I told you there was a big doctrinal point I want us to grab out of this too. And one of the big doctrinal ideas is, so Peter's great problem, and we're going to have to come back to this next week because we want to make the point that Peter's great problem isn't that he's teaching something wrong. It's just that he's doing something that encourages people who are wrong to be encouraged. And we'll come back to that because I think that's remarkable. I think it's very interesting to say that Peter's getting chastised. Peter's not telling people there should be two churches. Peter's just not saying it in a lot of ways. Peter's just kind of stepping out of this and saying, well, we'll just kind of let this, and Paul's going to confront him about this. But the doctrinal point is this. From where does the doctrine that the church is all one body, formed from two groups, where does that doctrine come from? Where does it come from? The unity of the church, the one Lord, one faith, one baptism. Where does that come from? Not a trick question. What's the big answer? Comes from God. Comes from God. This morning we're going to do a lesson and we're going to say it comes through Jesus who sent the Holy Spirit. Becky, I'll put you on the spot. Did it come from Peter? Peter preached it.
Well, he preached it,
but he didn't.
inspired by God.
He didn't create it. Now, why is that really important? Because if the doctrine was actually the apostles creating the doctrine, Peter couldn't be wrong, right? Peter would, there's a term that gets used sometimes, infallibility. It means that something that a church says or somebody says cannot be wrong. Peter, if he was the source of doctrine, could not be wrong. And Paul, all he could say was, well, I didn't know that was true. But Peter is wrong. He is in error. He's in a big error. And that's actually doctrinally really important. Becky, you had a comment on that.
So what I wanted to say is, wasn't it Peter that went to Cornelius?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Peter if it came from Peter, he could have said, no, I'm not going.
Yeah, right.
I don't agree with that.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go and speak.
And he says he doesn't really get it. He's kind of perplexed about what's going on in Acts chapter 10, but he's doing what he's told to do. But you're right. Now, why am I saying that's a huge doctrinal point? Because it means that doctrine isn't something we get to decide. I saw that one of the mainstream denominations this week is voting on something that we should say is pretty clear in the Bible, whether it's right or wrong. They're going to vote on it, though. And we always kind of look at that and say, roll our eyes. But here's the idea. Most churches believe that they have the right to establish doctrine. It's a super common belief that churches have. If Peter could say, well, this is the way I think it should be, and this is how we're going to do it, then Peter would have been demonstrating he had the right to create doctrine. Paul's not rebuking Peter because he says, no, Paul, I have more right to make doctrine than you. He's rebuking him because, hey, Peter, this is not the doctrine of Christ. You don't have the right to change the doctrine of Christ. You don't have the authority to teach something different. Paul would say at the beginning of this letter, when he talked about the doctrine of Christ, and we talked a lot about angels from heaven, but verse 8 of chapter 1, he said, if we, let's change the pronoun and say if I, not even Paul, has the authority to preach a doctrine different than the doctrine of Jesus Christ. Apostles, Paul would say elsewhere, I could lose my soul. But if apostles create doctrine, how could they lose their soul? Because whatever doctrine they're practicing is doctrine. But the point is, even the apostles are beneath doctrine. Now, who's above the apostles in regards to church authority? Just Jesus. So it's important to understand that anytime we have a conversation and somebody says, our church is voting on this, or our church leader has said this, or we appreciate the idea that doctrine, there's no negotiation with it. There's nothing we can say that it can be changed or anything, because in this moment, an apostle, a pretty prominent apostle, is being rebuked because he's mishandling the doctrine of Christ. That's actually extremely doctrinally important. We're out of time. So we're going to stop here. Michael, go ahead and hit the buzzers and let everybody run out of their classes, and we'll pick up here next time. We have a few more things to talk about here in this passage we just read.
Thank you for joining the Church of Christ in Cornelius, Oregon. We can be found on our website. You can scan the QR code on your screen or the CD you were given, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Cornelius Church of Christ. Thank you, and God bless.